Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, June 5th, 2024. The Senate fails to advance a bill that would guarantee access to contraception. The vote was 51 to 39, short of the 60 votes needed. House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries says a so-called leader has made the factually inaccurate statement that black folks were better off during Jim Crow. How dare you make such an ignorant observation? He was referring to comments reportedly from Republican Congressman Byron Donalds at a Donald Trump campaign event, as reported in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Byron Donalds responded that he never said that, and what he meant was there were more black families intact under Jim Crow, and that Democratic welfare policies since helped destroy the black family. We will hear comments from both members of Congress. The House passes the first fiscal year 2025 government spending bill for Veterans Affairs and military construction, despite including provisions dealing with abortion that the White House opposes. Some of the amendments considered over the past 2 days before final passage deal with immigration and NATO funding. President Biden is in France ahead of tomorrow's ceremonies for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, when the U.S. and Allied powers during World War II landed in Normandy and began the drive to liberate Western Europe from Nazi Germany. Boeing Starliner spacecraft launches with 2 astronauts on board after 2 failed attempts. We'll talk with Washington Post, NASA, and space industry reporter Christian Davenport about the importance of this mission and the future of NASA's collaboration with private companies for trips to the space station and beyond to the moon and Mars. And we start with the Senate voting not to advance the Right to Contraception Act, which would give Americans the right to access birth control, including pills, patches, implants, condoms, IUDs, and sterilization procedures. Washington Post article reads, the Democratic bill intended to put Republicans on the spot in an election year on their unpopular positions on reproductive rights would prevent states from passing laws that limit access to contraception, including hormonal birth control and IUDs. The vote is likely to be one of several that the Senate Majority Leader Charles E. Schumer, Democrat from New York, will tee up on reproductive rights as he seeks to protect a raft of vulnerable Democratic incumbents running in red and purple states this November. That was from the Washington Post. Senator Jackie Rosen, Democrat from Nevada, spoke about the birth control bill on the Senate floor before the vote.
The last 2 years have made it crystal clear. We cannot rely on the Supreme Court alone to protect our access to care. We know overturning Roe was just the beginning. If extreme anti-choice politicians and activists, if they have their way, access to birth control is next. Contraception has been safely used by millions of women for decades. It's allowed women to take control over their own bodies, to decide when they want to start a family, how many kids they want to have, who they want to start a family with. And for these very same reasons, the right to contraception has been a target of anti-choice extremists for years. So let me be clear. Overturning the right to contraception would be catastrophic in a post-Roe world. It would mean that women in states with the most restrictive abortion bans would have zero ability at all to make any decisions over their own bodies. They'd have no ability to prevent an unplanned pregnancy or get the care they need. Women would have zero ability to get the care they need or prevent a pregnancy. And this isn't just hypothetical. The Supreme Court has clearly demonstrated that it will not hesitate. They will not hesitate to reverse landmark decisions and take away women's reproductive freedoms. That's why my colleagues and I introduced the Right to Contraception Act, to codify women's constitutional right to make family planning decisions. And this bill will do exactly what is in the name. It will just guarantee the right for women to access and to use birth control. It will guarantee the right for women to have access to contraception.
Senator Jackie Rosen, Democrat from Nevada, on the Senate floor before the Senate voted not to advance this bill, the vote short of the 60 votes needed. An article from WUSA-TV in D.C. reads, since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, there has been confusion as to whether states have the right to take away access to some forms of birth control. with some lawmakers arguing that IUDs and emergency birth control pills can be used to induce an abortion. Legislation has been proposed in several states to restrict certain types of contraception, specifically IUDs. That was from WUSA-TV, D.C. Senator Joni Ernst, Republican from Iowa, opposed the bill on the Senate floor today and spoke about it.
The so-called Right to Contraception Act goes far beyond the scope of providing access to contraception. It's important the American people understand what the Democrats are peddling. Senator Markey's bill creates a precedent to mandate access to abortion drugs for women and girls of all ages. It also allows taxpayer dollars to be funneled to organizations like Planned Parenthood. The bill removes conscious freedom protections, which allow our doctors and nurses to maintain their religious and moral beliefs while practicing medicine, a right that we are all afforded in the workplace, which should be upheld. I would like to remind my Democrat colleagues of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA is what we call it here. It is a law that was championed by Senator Chuck Schumer more than 30 years ago. The Majority Leader has really come a long way, hasn't he? Just like President Biden, who used to be pro-life. Religious professionals and organizations across the country rely on RFRA for protection from broad government overreach. Yet the Democrats are willing to upend that precedent for politics and, more importantly, for abortion.
Senator Joni Ernst, Republican from Iowa, on the Senate floor. C-SPAN's Capitol Hill producer Craig Kaplan tweeting, 51-39. Senate voted against beginning work on legislation to establish federal protections for access to contraception. 2 Republicans voted yes. Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, switched his vote to no and filed a motion to reconsider to allow for another vote. 60 votes were needed to advance the bill. By the way, Senator Ernst talking today as well about a bill she introduced to encourage more birth control methods to be developed that can be sold over the counter, not including the morning after pill. A lot of reaction today to a Philadelphia Inquirer article covering a Donald Trump campaign event on Tuesday in Philadelphia called Congress, Cognac, and Cigars, with 2 African-American members of Congress, Byron Donalds of Florida and Wesley Hunt of Texas. Part of the article reads, Donalds said he is starting to see the reinvigoration of the black family, which he described as younger people forming nuclear family units and helping to breathe the revival of a black middle class in America. He went on to say that those family values had previously been eroded by Democratic policies that black voters embraced after becoming loyal to the party due to the civil rights movement. And then quoting Byron Donalds in this article, he said, you see, during Jim Crow, the black family was together. During Jim Crow, more black people were not just conservative. Black people have always been conservative-minded, but more black people voted conservatively. And then HEW, Lyndon Johnson, you go down that road, and now we are where we are. He said, referring to the former U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and referring to former President Lyndon Johnson. That was reporting from the Philadelphia Inquirer. The House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, spoke today on the House floor.
Mr. Speaker, it has come to my attention that a so-called leader has made the factually inaccurate statement that black folks were better off during Jim Crow. That's an outlandish, outrageous, and out-of-pocket observation. We were not better off when a young boy named Emmett Till could be brutally murdered without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when black women could be sexually assaulted without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when people could be systematically lynched without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when children could be denied a high-quality education without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when people could be denied the right to vote without consequence because of Jim Crow. How dare you make such an ignorant observation? You better check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, the minority leader, today on the House floor, referring to Congressman Byron Donalds, Republican from Florida, who retweeted Congressman Jeffries' video and added, "You need to check your sources and stop lying to the American people because you and President Biden are losing black men. I didn't say that. This is what I said." And he attached a video.
America, Joe Biden's campaign is lying to you once again, and they're gaslighting. Now they're trying to say that I said black people were doing better under Jim Crow. I never said that. They are lying. But why would you be surprised? Because they always lie. This is the same Joe Biden that said, if you don't vote for him, then you ain't black. The man is a liar. Sorry, just call it what it is. What I said is that you had more black families under Jim Crow. And it was the Democrat policies under HEW, under the welfare state, that did help to destroy the black family. That's what I said. And I also said you're seeing a reinvigoration of black families today in America. And that is a good thing. So don't listen to the lies from the Biden administration. I know what I said, and I'll say it straight to camera. They got to run to the Philadelphia Inquirer to move their lies. Joe Biden does not care about black people. He never has. He cares about power. First, second, and third. They can go somewhere with all that. See ya.
Congressman Byron Donalds, Republican from Florida, posting that video. A Democratic National Committee senior spokesperson, Marcus W. Robinson, released a statement that reads, "This is Donald Trump's MAGA Republican Party. VP contender Byron Donalds is praising Jim Crow, suggesting that black families were better off during segregation." Story from The Hill. 4 vulnerable House Democrats on Wednesday bucked their party on a vote to pass the annual Department of Veterans Affairs and Military Construction Funding bill just days after the White House threatened to veto the measure. Over partisan riders, the party has termed poison pills. Democrats have come out strongly against the bill, which includes a rider they say would restrict the VA from carrying out a Biden administration rule that allows veterans to have greater access to abortion counseling and abortions in certain circumstances. Democrats have also targeted other riders they say would block the VA from implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and block access to gender-affirming care, among other measures. That was from The Hill. The vote in the House today to pass the bill was 209 to 197. The 4 Democrats who voted yes: Marie Glusenkamp Perez of Washington State, Jared Golden of Maine, Vicente Gonzalez of Texas, and Mary Peltola of Alaska. 2 Republicans voted no: Tom McClintock of California and Matt Rosendale of Montana. This came after 2 days of amendments being offered, debated, and voted on. One today was from Republican Greg Steube of Florida and concerned immigration. You'll hear a response from Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat, also from Florida, ranking member on the Appropriations Subcommittee.
In December of last year, I led a letter to the VA along with 23 other Republican members after receiving reports that the VA had contracted with ICE to process medical claims for illegal aliens in ICE custody. Considering the record numbers of illegal aliens streaming across our border thanks to the Biden administration's reckless policies, we were concerned that the VA personnel were being taken away from their mission to serve our veterans. I'm pleased that the underlying bill prohibits the VA from providing benefits directly to illegal aliens. However, my amendment is still necessary to ensure that the VA resources are focused solely on veterans, since the current interagency arrangement allows the VA to provide this service to ICE. The VA exists to serve American veterans who risk their lives to protect our great country. For far too long, the VA has fallen short in its mission, and I quote, "to fulfill President Lincoln's promise, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, by serving and honoring the men and women who are Americans' veterans." Unfortunately, veterans continue to experience unacceptable wait times in receiving medical care and disability benefits. In particular, the VA's disability claim backlog has been a source of significant frustration in the veteran community. After several years under the Trump administration in which the VA disability claims backlog was consistently under 100,000 claims, the backlog has nearly tripled under the Biden administration to 278,000 as of last week. This is an abject failure, and our veterans deserve better from the VA. Despite the longstanding issues with its claims backlog and customer service issues, VA personnel are being tasked with serving claims for government-funded health care for illegal immigrants, not veterans. VA resources should be used solely for veterans and their survivors. Congress appropriates funds to the VA to provide services to our veterans, not illegal immigrants. Our veterans serve our country, and it is high time that our government starts serving them. I reserve the balance of my time.
From Florida reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The VA provides a purely administrative function for Immigration and Customs Enforcement to process medical claims. Moreover, ICE pays for these services, not the VA. There are no funds in this bill to prohibit being spent. ICE pays VA to process their medical claims. This is an amendment that doesn't even apply to funding in our bill. This amendment is misplaced, and it conflates the services that the VA actually provides with the larger issue of immigration because, our friends on the other side of the aisle never miss an opportunity to bash immigrants who are simply trying to come to this country and make a better way of life for themselves and their families. And it's once again injecting unnecessary policy debates into a historically bipartisan bill. Another poison pill culture war rider. Whatever your position is on immigration, this amendment does not belong in the Milcon VA bill and does nothing to move us forward towards better health care and services for our veterans. The reality is that if the gentleman's amendment passes, then ICE would have to stand up an entirely separate process that would have to be set up to process these claims, because the claims have to get processed, if VA didn't manage it for them. That would be incredibly expensive, fiscally irresponsible, and makes no sense. But again, we shouldn't miss an opportunity to bash veterans. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, particularly because this amendment purports to prohibit funds from being spent that you can't spend because they're not in this bill.
Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat from Florida, responding to the amendment offered by Congressman Greg Steube, Republican from Florida. The amendment to the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Spending Bill for fiscal year 2025, and the amendment passed by voice vote. Another amendment offered to the bill was from Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, happened on Tuesday, and it dealt with NATO funding.
My amendment would strike over $433 million in NATO funding from the bill. America should not be doling out hundreds of millions of dollars to international organizations to help them fight their enemies, especially when they are unwilling to fight for themselves. As of 2023, a majority of NATO countries do not meet their pledge to spend a minimum of 2% of their GDP on defense. The United States has been financing and promising to defend NATO countries for decades and paying more than its fair share, all while countries like Germany fail to fulfill their NATO obligations. European countries could and should be stepping up their financial contributions to ensure the security of NATO. Instead, they prefer the U.S. taxpayer to foot the bill, and if the time comes for American service members to die for them. Our continued involvement in NATO only undermines the security of our nation because it embroils the United States in other countries' military entanglements, even if the United States has no direct interest. This is exactly what has happened in Ukraine, which could become a part of NATO. Billions of American taxpayer dollars go to the corruption capital of the world, and the sanctions placed on Russia end up actually hurting Americans.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, offering her amendment on the House floor. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat of Florida, spoke against it.
Worldwide, in U.S. military infrastructure, 30% of our military infrastructure is in fair or poor condition. We should be investing in these much-needed infrastructure projects, and cutting funding for the NATO Security Investment Program is not only bad policy from a national security perspective, it's not sound long-term fiscal policy. The deterrence that NATO provides now is a small cost to avoid future conflict. As I stated last year during debate on this issue, regardless of your stance on overall defense spending levels of various NATO countries, it is simply not true that the United States is paying more than its share of this direct contribution program. This amendment does not recognize the cost-effective benefit of the NATO security investment programs that provides to the United States. The U.S. contributes less than 16% of the funding for the NATO security investment program, but 44% of the locations for which projects are selected benefit U.S. posture locations. If the U.S. contributed at the same cost share relative to national wealth that our allies do, our cost share would be 47% rather than the under 16% that we actually pay.
Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat from Florida, on the House floor on Tuesday. Debate on an amendment offered by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene to the Military Construction Veterans Affairs spending bill for the next fiscal year. The amendment failed on a vote of 46 yes and 354 no. The underlying spending bill provides about $379 billion for the VA and military construction and family housing at the Defense Department, most of the money for veterans' benefits and health care. It's the first of the 12 annual fiscal year 2025 spending bills to pass the House. The vote on the bill itself, 209 to 197. House and Senate will not be in session for legislative business for the rest of the week, so members can travel to France for tomorrow's 80th anniversary of D-Day, the Allies' invasion of Nazi Germany occupied France in 1944. President Joe Biden flew to France Tuesday night, and on the way, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke to reporters on Air Force One about the president's trip and agenda.
He'll have the opportunity on Thursday to meet with veterans who participated in the D-Day landing, and also to join fellow leaders in celebrating that anniversary and giving a speech that will talk about, against the backdrop of war in Europe today, the sacrifices that those heroes and those veterans made 80 years ago, and how it's our obligation to continue their mission to fight for freedom. Then on Friday, he will return to Normandy to speak at Pointe du Hoc, which is a 100-foot tall cliff that Army Rangers scaled under gunfire to take fortified German positions. And he'll talk about the stakes of that moment, an existential fight between dictatorship and freedom. He'll talk about the men who scaled those cliffs and how they put themselves they put the country ahead of themselves. And he'll talk about the dangers of isolationism and how if we back dictators and fail to stand up to them, they keep going, and ultimately America and the world pays a greater price. And over the course of the 2 days, he'll really be drawing a through line from World War II through the Cold War and the stand-up of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, the NATO alliance, to today, where we face once again war in Europe, where NATO has rallied to defend freedom and sovereignty in Europe, where NATO has in fact expanded under President Biden's leadership, and we're all working together with the coalition of 50 nations to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia's brutal aggression. Where today in 2024, 80 years later, we see dictators once again attempting to challenge the order, attempting to march in Europe, and that freedom-loving nations need to rally to stand against that as we have.
The White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He also said President Biden will be meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Normandy, France, and again on the sidelines of the G7 meeting in Italy a week later. And while in France, he will have a state visit to that country and meet with French President Emmanuel Macron. Jake Sullivan speaking to reporters on Air Force One as the press corps and he and the president all flew to France Tuesday night. From Reuters, a gunman fired shots at the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon on Wednesday and was wounded in an exchange of fire with troops, the Lebanese army said. The army said the attacker, a Syrian national, was detained and taken to the hospital for treatment, and soldiers were searching through the area for any gunmen. U.S. Embassy said small arms fire was reported near its entrance in the morning, but the facility and staff were safe. U.S. Ambassador Lisa Johnson is currently traveling outside Lebanon, according to diplomatic sources. That reporting from Reuters. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller was asked about this incident today. He was also asked about concerns that there could be an increased fighting across the Lebanese-Israeli border as an extension of Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza.
So before we get into the rest of the Middle East, can you just give us an update, if you have one, or even if you don't have one, on what happened in Beirut?
So, yes, earlier today there was a shooting incident outside of our embassy in Beirut. One member of the embassy's local guard force was seriously injured. The gunman was arrested after the incident. The U.S. Embassy remains in contact with the Lebanese authorities as they investigate the incident. In terms of embassy security, the embassy was secured immediately. We achieved full accountability of all official U.S. citizens and locally employed staff. And the embassy closed today following the incident, but plans to be open for business as usual tomorrow.
Okay. Do you have any idea about who did it?
So
relying entirely on the Lebanese?
So the DSS is coordinated with the Lebanese to answer that question. We are aware that the individual who was arrested was wearing what appeared to be ISIS insignia, but we are conducting a full investigation with the Lebanese authorities into the actual motivations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Same subject. There have now been 5 people, along with the shooter, that have been apprehended in Lebanon. Can you say at this point, is there any indication, indeed, that there is some kind of cell working against the embassy?
Excuse me, as I got something stuck in my throat. It's an ongoing investigation. I don't want to get ahead of that. Yeah.
Staying in the region, how worried are you given the Israeli Prime Minister's comments on the northern front of Lebanon? How worried are you that could spin out of control at any time?
So we do remain incredibly concerned about the risk of isolation along the Israel-Lebanon border. It's something we've been concerned about since the immediate aftermath of October 7th. And we have been engaged in intense diplomatic conversations and intense diplomatic negotiations to try to avoid that conflict from escalating beyond control. Now, a few things. Number one, and you heard me say this yesterday, it is an untenable situation for Israel right now that there are tens of thousands of Israeli citizens who cannot return to their homes in the north of Israel because it's not safe to do so because of the risk of, not the risk, but the reality of constant Hezbollah shelling and drone attacks in the area. That said, the government of Israel has long maintained, privately to us, and they've said it publicly too, that their preferred solution to this conflict is a diplomatic one, and we continue to pursue a diplomatic resolution because we don't want to see that escalation of the conflict, which would just lead to further loss of life from both Israelis and the Lebanese people, and would greatly harm Israel's overall security and stability in the region. So we've been kind of two things. One, there's this track we've been pursuing all along, but then secondly, one of the reasons we think a ceasefire in Gaza is so important is because that ceasefire would unlock the potential for us to actually achieve lasting calm in the north, and it is one of the reasons we continue to pursue it.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference in Washington. Story from the Jerusalem Post: the IDF is prepared military action against Hezbollah. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said during a visit Wednesday morning to the northern border. He said, "Whoever thinks that he will hurt us and that we will sit idly by is making a big mistake. We are prepared for very intense action in the north. One way or another, we will restore security to the north," he stressed. That was from the Jerusalem Post. And the Iranian mission to the United Nations giving a statement to Newsweek that reads, "Although Netanyahu might seek to escalate the crisis and expand the geography of the war to maintain his grip on power, the rulers of the Zionist regime and its supporters are acutely aware that, having already failed against Hamas, they will undoubtedly face a more formidable defeat against Hezbollah, which boasts significantly superior military strength compared to Hamas." Washington Today continues in a moment.
The House will be in order.
This year, C-SPAN celebrates 45 years of covering Congress like no other. Since 1979, we've been your primary source for Capitol Hill, providing balanced, unfiltered coverage of government, taking you to where the policies debated and decided, all with the support of America's cable companies. C-SPAN, 45 years and counting, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app, and that's free, and wherever you find your podcasts. A few more headlines from Deadline.com. The Wall Street Journal has come under extensive criticism from the White House for a report on Joe Biden's mental acuity, with spokespersons blasting the story for featuring just one on-the-record Republican source, former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, to claim that the president is slipping. On Wednesday morning, Morning Joe on MSNBC added to the chorus, with Joe Scarborough calling it a Trump hit piece. The title of the Wall Street Journal article is Behind Closed Doors, Biden Shows Signs of Slipping. From the Washington Examiner, House Republicans referred Hunter and James Biden to the Department of Justice on Wednesday for criminal prosecution over allegations they lied to Congress during closed-door interviews about their business dealings. Congressman James Comer and Jim Jordan and Jason Smith, the House chairman leading an impeachment inquiry into President Joe Biden, detailed in a letter that they described as overwhelming evidence of felony false statement and perjury violations. That was from the Washington Examiner. And from CNN, a Georgia appeals court has halted the election subversion conspiracy case against former President Donald Trump and several of his co-defendants until a panel of judges rules on whether Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis should be disqualified. The new order filed on Wednesday from the Georgia Court of Appeals is the latest indication that a trial in the state-level Georgia election subversion case will not occur before the 2024 presidential election. That was from CNN. The third time was the charm, writes SpaceFlightNow.com, for the first crewed flight of Boeing Starliner spacecraft after two launch attempts on May 6th and June 1st ended with scrubs. The Atlas V rocket roared off Pad 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, beginning a more than week-long mission for NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams. Liftoff took place on June 5th at 10:52 a.m. Eastern, finally marking the first crewed flight of Boeing Starliner spacecraft after years of delay and setbacks. That was SpaceFlightNow.com. This is what it sounded like.
Status check. Go Atlas. Go Centaur. Go Starliner. Godspeed, Butch and Sonny.
Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. And liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V, carrying two American heroes, drawing a line to the stars for all of us.
After the launch, NASA held a news conference, starting with Administrator Bill Nelson.
This is another milestone in this extraordinary history of NASA. And I want to give my personal congratulations to the whole team that went through a lot of trial and tribulation, but they had perseverance. And that's what we do at NASA. We don't launch until it's right. And so for Boeing and the ULA teams, the NASA teams, congratulations to all of you. Now, Butch and Sonny do what they do best. They're test pilots. And they're going to test this thing from izzard to gizzard. And they're going to certify it for a rotational basis to send crew to the International Space Station. So now with Dragon and Starliner, the U.S. is going to have two unique human space transportation systems. And that, of course, we always like to have a backup that makes it safer for our astronauts. And that's why we started the commercial crew program in the first place, partnering with U.S. companies to deliver safe and reliable spaceflight at the same time of cutting the cost. So it's different from the old days, but we go with our commercial partners now. And when we expand our fleet of spacecraft, what we're doing is expanding our reach to the stars.
NASA Administrator Bill Nelson at a news conference at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Washington Post reporter Christian Davenport covers NASA and the space industry and joins us now on the phone to talk about today's launch. Thanks for being with us. You wrote that officials from NASA and Boeing said after the launch they felt a sense of relief and redemption. What does this mean for the programs and missions of the agency and the company?
The Deputy NASA Administrator, Pam Melroy, once told me, she said it's existential for Boeing and for NASA. They desperately need Boeing to be able to complete this mission and to do it safely. Right now, NASA has SpaceX to fly its crews to the International Space Station, but they want another provider. If anything happens with one of the rockets or the spacecraft, they want to be able to have a backup. And Boeing has just been delayed by years, and they've struggled with the spacecraft to get it ready to be able to fly crews. So they feel a huge sense of relief that at least it got off the ground with a pair of astronauts. But that said, there's a lot more to this mission left to go.
Well, it is a test mission. What are they testing?
Right. That's a great question. So this is part of a test campaign. They did a pair of flights earlier without any astronauts on board. They flew the Starliner, essentially empty or with a test dummy because it is autonomous. Now they've got the astronauts on board and they want to see how it does supporting human life and what it's like for the astronauts, what the ride is like. While it's an autonomous spacecraft, the astronauts, Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmar, are going to take over manual control over the spacecraft to see how it flies. They need to see, once it docks with the International Space Station, if it can be used as an emergency lifeboat if something goes wrong on the International Space Station and they need to use Starliner to evacuate. Ultimately, they've got to run it through all of its tests to make sure it can support human spaceflight and take crews up and down from the space station safely.
The U.S. space program, if all goes well, you mentioned will have 2 commercial options for putting humans in space. Today, though, they used a rocket that dated from the 1960s. Interesting combination of old and new.
Yeah, and while the rocket, the Atlas V, its heritage goes back to the 1960s, this is more of an upgraded version of the Atlas rocket family. But yes, the Atlas rocket goes back to the early days of the space age. I mean, really to the dawn, and John Glenn and the Mercury program launching on Atlas family rockets. This one is, has a lot of upgrades and has been very reliable with so far 100% mission success. But this version of the Atlas rocket, the Atlas V, had never flown humans before until today. So that's a big milestone. And now, the company that operates the Atlas family of rockets, the United Launch Alliance, is back in the business of flying humans.
We're talking with Washington Post reporter Christian Davenport. Every presidential administration, I think going back to George W. Bush, has set dates to return to the moon and then go on to Mars. What is the current schedule, and are we on pace?
Yeah, so now NASA has its Artemis program, which was born in the Trump administration. Initially, the presidential administration, Vice President Pence, had hoped that NASA would get there by 2024. That is clearly not happening. The date now for a return of humans to the lunar surface is late in 2026, but it's so far away and there's so many hurdles left to be done. Whether they can keep that date remains to be seen. They still have a lot of development, not just with the rocket and the spacecraft, but the lunar lander itself that will ferry the astronauts down to the lunar surface and back up to lunar orbit. The spacesuits they're going to wear on the surface are still under development, so there's still a lot of work to be done. And, certain watchdog groups have said that, 2027 or 2028 is perhaps a more realistic time frame, but at least officially it's late 2026 for that.
And all of this takes money. In the ups and downs recently, what has been the level of support for NASA in Congress and among the American people?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. I mean, what you're seeing on the one hand is good support in the sense that this is the first time that subsequent presidential administrations have embraced, deep space a human exploration campaign, since the Apollo era. To have the Biden administration embrace Artemis, which was, as I said earlier, a Trump program, it's got momentum, but it still needs a lot of funding from Congress to keep it on track. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson has said they have enough funding to make the 2026 timeframe. But that remains to be seen, because in all of these programs, there are always setbacks. There are always delays. It costs more money. And nobody at NASA, or I think even in Congress, wants NASA to launch if they feel like it's unsafe or they're not ready. And just recently, NASA, the Inspector General, talked about some concerns that NASA had with the heat shield of Orion after they did their first test flight without crew, sending Orion around the moon. So if there are, need to be delays for safety reasons, that's going to, cost more time and more money. And so I think all of that remains to be seen.
Washington Post reporter Christian Davenport has beat NASA and the space industry. You can find his stories at WashingtonPost.com. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
On Wall Street today, the Dow up 96, NASDAQ up 330, S&P up 62. E&E News reported last week that the Biden administration announced that $1.3 billion in funds from the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law would support expanding the electric vehicle charging network beyond the highway and closer to where people live. The money will go to install plug-in spots at a wide variety of locations, apartment buildings, and destinations where vehicles are parked, including depots where fleet vehicles spend the night, according to a statement from the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. The administration said it was opening applications for the grants. The funds are the most recent installment of a key part of the infrastructure law, which allocated $7.5 billion to create a backbone of plug-in stations to serve EVs. That was from E&E News last week. Today, the Federal Highway Administration Administrator, Shaylin Batt, was asked about this program at a hearing with Senator Jeff Merkley, Democrat from Oregon.
The infrastructure bill funded 500,000, as you put it, charging ports. How many of those charging ports have been deployed?
So of the bipartisan infrastructure law funds, yes. So 6 states have deployed NEVI funds. I'll say it's dozens of ports, so under 100. Like of those 6 NEVI sites that are out there, it is dozens of charging ports. I can get you the specific number.
Okay, yeah, if you could, because I've heard it only 7 out of 500,000.
7 sites, and then, yes.
That is pathetic. Like, we're now 3 years into this. Now, if you come out to my state and you're looking to drive an electric vehicle around the state, even utilizing just those that are near the major highways, not a single one's been built. Not one. 3 years in, not one. What's the problem?
Well, thank you, Senator. And I share your frustration around the speed of the deployment here. I've been the administrator for 18 months. We have worked with every single state to develop their plans, both for NEVI, which is a charger every 50 miles along the NHS, and then also on CFI, which is more of the charging and fueling infrastructure deployments in cities. And so what is the problem? There's a number of problems. States have huge amounts of other programs that they're working with. We have stood up the regulations. There's Title 23 concerns. We're working through them on a state-by-state basis. But what I said in my opening statement is true. There are thousands of chargers that are going to come online this year. And we are on track to hit the president's goal of 500,000 charging ports before the end of the decade. So share your frustration on where we are today, but confident that we're going to hit the goal.
Yeah. Well, it is a big deal because you can't really depend upon an electric car if there's not a charging capability. And the fact that we passed this bill years ago and not one charging station has been built in my state, and only 7, as you put it, 7 sites around the country, that is a vast administrative failure.
Senator Jeff Merkley, Democrat from Oregon, questioning the head of the Federal Highway Administration, Shaylin Batt, at today's Senate Environment and Public Works Committee hearing. You can find the video of the full hearing covered by C-SPAN at cspan.org. Story from ABC News. This year's World Environment Day comes with a sobering reminder about the severity of global warming, according to climate experts. New climate warnings were announced Wednesday, including that the planet is experiencing its warmest May on record, in turn bringing the tally to 12 consecutive months of record-breaking globally, according to a report from the World Meteorological Organization. That was ABC News. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke about this at a World Environment Day program at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City.
Dear friends of the planet, today is World Environment Day. It is also the day that the European Commission's Copernicus Climate Change Service officially reports May 2024 as the hottest May in recorded history. This marks 12 straight months of the hottest months ever. For the past year, every turn of the calendar has turned up the heat. Our planet is trying to tell us something, but we don't seem to be listening. Dear friends, the American Museum of Natural History is the ideal place to make the point. This great museum tells the amazing story of our natural world, of the vast forces that have shaped life on Earth over billions of years. And humanity is just one small blip on the radar. But like the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs, we are having an outsized impact. In the case of climate, we are not the dinosaurs. We are the meteor. We are not only in danger, we are the danger. But we are also the solution. So, dear friends, we are at a moment of truth. The truth is, almost 10 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted, the target of limiting long-term global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is hanging by a thread.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City for World Environment Day, a day established by the UN in 1972. And he was introduced by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who is now special envoy to the Secretary on climate ambition and solutions. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word, and you'll get the stories that are making headlines in Washington sent to you each day by email. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.